Mabuhay! Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. My name is Christine, and this is episode 6, The Michael Meiring Mystery. Before I start today's episode, I would like to ask you to follow Lagim on all its social media accounts. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, and on TikTok at Lagim Podcast. We are also on Facebook, so just search for Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. Lagim is also officially on YouTube now, so you can stream all the past episodes and this one right now on youtube.com. I have also set up a Patreon page for Lagim on patreon.com. You can support this little podcast of mine by becoming a patron. As of now, I only have one tier, which will allow you early access to episodes and bonus content such as Q&A episodes as soon as you subscribe. So make sure that you look for Lagim Podcast on patreon.com. Lastly, please also rate Lagim on Apple Podcasts to help give this little passion project of mine a bit of a boost. Content warning. This episode contains brief references to burn and explosion injuries, so make sure that you take care of yourself whilst listening. As a true crime and crime mystery fan, I do love a good conspiracy theory or a good James Bond-esque case. When I first heard and read about today's story, my gut reaction was to immediately believe that it was a conspiracy, because even though I have been trained to question absolutely everything during my training as a lawyer, I do like to sometimes imagine a world with the most unbelievable conspiracies and spy plots. So, naturally, I had to take a step back and remind myself that although life can be stranger than fiction, fiction can and is mostly still more tantalizing than true life. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that I can only give you the things I have learned about the case, and I can forewarn you to take some of the information with a grain of salt. But ultimately, the decision is yours. Do you believe the story? Do you not believe the story? Or do you just want to be entertained? A lot of the more solid information I found online about this case is from a 3-parter Manila Times article published in 2002, written and reported by the journalists Dorian Zumel Sikat and Janet Andrade. Again, all links to my resources can be found in Lagim's blog. You can access the blog by checking out Lagim's Instagram page and clicking on the link on its bio. So, here's what we know about the Meiring mystery. On the 16th of May 2002, a horrible explosion took place in my hometown, Davao City, specifically in the Evergreen Hotel located along Magsaysay Avenue. Reports would later reveal that the explosion took place in Suite 306, then occupied by a man called Michael Terence Meiring. Meiring was a regular at Evergreen Hotel and had always requested to check into Suite 306, to which hotel management always obliged. A few days before the explosion, Meiring gave stern instructions to the hotel and its cleaning team that there was a metal box in his room that was not to be touched under any circumstances. Investigators would later reveal that this box was indeed the source of the explosion because it contained explosives, dynamite to be exact. Meiring, after the explosion, was then rushed to a local hospital after sustaining severe burn injuries and having both of his legs severely injured from the blast. Both legs had to then be amputated later on at the hospital. No one else was hurt in the hotel, but the explosion caused immense damage to the hotel's structure. Davao City Police officials did not formally charge Meiring right away, presumably because they wanted to ascertain first what on earth had happened and how the dynamite got into Meiring's room in the first place. However, after 3 days, the police had finally made up its mind and were set to charge Meiring whilst he was still at the hospital. Around this time, it was reported that Meiring had disappeared from his hospital bed. According to reports later on, Meiring was taken from his hospital bed by official looking men in the middle of the night. These official looking men apparently waved around FBI badges to legitimize their actions of taking Meiring away, fully knowing that Meiring was soon to be formally charged by the local police in Davao City. The hospital management would later disclose that normally Meiring should not have been released, as he had just undergone a double amputation of his legs. But the hospital owner also told reporters later on that he indeed agreed for Meiring to be taken away after American officials promised to issue a work visa for his daughter, who was a nurse. Whether this indeed came to fruition or not is unfortunately not known. So, Meiring was essentially whisked away to Manila from Davao on a Subic Air flight to receive further medical care at Makati Medical, a hospital that was covered by his medical insurance policy. This was on the 22nd of May, 2002. Then Mayor Rodrigo Duterte was not happy at all about this development in the Meiring mystery, and made his frustration known about the situation in interviews following the blast. He wanted Meiring to be held accountable for the explosion, or at least be made available for questioning. Later on, we will hear that Rodrigo Duterte, who is now president of the Philippines, has not easily forgotten what had happened at Evergreen Hotel, and this essentially also influenced his dealings with the American government as president of the Philippines. The Manila Times journalists Zumasikat and Andrade attempted to visit Meiring at the hospital when this story was still developing back in 2002, but they did not get anywhere near him. Or better said, they could not. Meiring was apparently only allowed to speak with his doctor, who was handpicked by the U.S. Embassy. When the Times journalists attempted to speak to one of his watchers at the hospital, they were also very much forbidden to do so. In their findings, Zumasikat and Andrade also found out that Immigration Deputy Commissioner at the time, Daniel Cueto, admitted that despite reports about Meiring's sudden departure from Davao with help of men carrying FBI badges, Cueto confirmed that the agents who escorted Meiring to Manila were actually from the U.S. National Security Council, or at least it was a combination of both. The men were both from the U.S. National Security Council and the FBI. Naturally, this situation that was very much veiled in mystery from the word go begged the ultimate question: who on earth is Michael Meiring? I am afraid that even this simple question has anything but a straightforward answer. The hotel employees at Evergreen Hotel knew him to be a treasure hunter who had been visiting the Philippines since the early 90s. Zumasikat and Andrade would later also uncover that some people knew Meiring to also be a doctor, specifically an oncologist who dabbled in herbal medicine, although not much credence was given to this speculation. As for his nationality or citizenship, it was confirmed by the Manila Times article that Meiring was indeed a former citizen of South Africa, but of British descent, who then fled to the US during the apartheid regime in South Africa. Now, as earlier mentioned, Zumalsikat and Andrade reported that Meiring had been visiting the Philippines since the early 90s. Specifically, Meiring first visited the Philippines in 1992. According to the article by the Manila Times, on his first visit to the Philippines, he stayed a whole year in Manila, where he stayed at the Sundowner Hotel or Manila Garden Hotel. Whilst in Manila, he apparently was observed to be traveling around the capital with 2 NBI agents. His stated purpose during this first visit was to treasure hunt and research plants to use as medicine. It was also revealed in the same article that Meiring was married to a nurse who then worked in California. But Meiring was no ordinary tourist or doe-eyed treasure hunter. He had connections with some very significant people, not only in the national government but also and specifically in southern Mindanao. He had been said to rub shoulders with then MNLF chairman Noor Miswari and then MILF chief Hashim Salamat. He was even suspected to be acquainted with the then NPA leader Father Navarro. Now, for those of you who may not have grown up in the Philippines and wonder what those ominous sounding acronyms are, let me help you. MNLF stands for the Moro National Liberation Front. This is a political organization of Filipino Muslim separatists, mainly in the southern part of the country. MILF stands for Moro Islamic Liberation Front. They are also a Filipino Muslim organization that seeks autonomy from the Filipino government. Lastly, NPA stands for New People's Army, which is a communist armed rebel group within the Philippines which has ties to the Communist Party of the Philippines. Now back to Meiring. It comes to no surprise that with such friends as Noor Miswari and Hashim Salamat, the Philippine military became worried about Meiring. They therefore thought that it would be wise to have him under surveillance on an intermittent basis. What they found out will forever remain a mystery because that information is unfortunately not in the public domain. So we are left to wonder, fantasize, or imagine what things they have heard or seen whilst surveilling Meiring. Now, I mentioned that the Manila Times article said that Meiring was also a doctor who dabbled in herbal medicine, and that was one of the two goals that he had when visiting the Philippines. Personally, and my gut instinct says that this doctor's story is a ruse. I think that Meiring's main goal was to treasure hunt, and he had done so for a lot of years whilst visiting the Philippines. It looked like from the Manila Times article that he had spent a hefty amount of money to pursue this treasure hunting endeavor of his. It is still unknown who actually was financing him all those years, whether it was only one person financing him or several persons or groups that were financing him. Zumel Sikat and Andrade speculated that he may have received some medical research grants from South Africa for his herbal medicine research, but I remain skeptical about this. Meiring's private secretary named Sylvia Durante apparently admitted to both journalists that Meiring indeed received monies from the South African government. I do have some nagging questions about this admission by Durante. How much was exactly given to Meiring by the South African government? Was the money given solely for the medical research, or did the South African government also fund Meiring's treasure hunt? If they knew who Meiring was, were they not worried that Meiring would possibly misappropriate funds and just use all the money for treasure hunting? And lastly, was the South African government maybe a part of the treasure hunting endeavors by Meiring? Now, unfortunately, I don't have the answers to all these questions, but the journalists who reported and investigated for the Manila Times back in 2002 seem to have made a connection between the treasure hunting endeavors by Michael Meiring and the South African government. The Manila Times article revealed that a friend of Meiring's called David Hawthorne, an American, was allegedly informed by Meiring before the Evergreen Hotel explosion that Meiring had finally become lucky in his hunt for treasure. He apparently found some U.S. federal notes. Meiring told David Hawthorne that in 1992 he was able to sell one box of these federal notes for about $500 million. When asked about the nature or source of the box, Meiring explained to Hawthorne that the box was one of 12 boxes that were part of a war chest for both US American and Filipino guerrillas who then fought the Japanese in the Second World War. By all accounts, after the war, those boxes had just disappeared into thin air. Rumors about them abound, and treasure hunters had another item or two to add on their list of things to hunt. And one of them got lucky. Meiring did. Now, as an interesting side note, after the explosion in Davao, news reports would later quote then Mayor Rodrigo Duterte that Meiring had been under surveillance way before the explosion because he had apparently been involved in a business transaction involving counterfeit federal notes. Now, I do not know if these federal notes are of the same group of federal notes that Meiring managed to sell for $500 million back in 1992. Needless to say, Meiring did not fly under the radar when he was in Davao. The police had their eyes on him, if maybe for different reasons. Now, let's go back to David Hawthorne, Meiring's friend. David Hawthorne told the journalists from the Manila Times that Meiring was not only a doctor for the South African police specifically, but he was also a supporter of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. It is with this information in mind that Meiring further admitted to Hawthorne that the money from the sale of that one box of federal notes in 1992 in reality went to the Mandela government. Hawthorne, in an attempt to boost his credibility, further admitted to the Manila Times journalists that Meiring showed him a letter from the South African government and a U.S. Treasury permit to back his claim about these federal notes. Hawthorne claimed that he saw a packing list that had a cover sheet with the words U.S. Army printed on them. On the sheet, he also saw the Army seal, some numbers, and a group of uppercase letters. Hawthorne recounted how Meiring told him that this specific list stood for serial numbers of the missing notes that dated back to 1937. Now, a treasure hunter does not stop with one single find. The prospect of potentially finding 12 more boxes is naturally attractive for treasure hunters. So, Meiring, according to Hawthorne, made it his life's pursuit to find as many boxes as possible, but also to continue hunting for other treasures. This led to Meiring's visiting the Philippines many times since 1992. So Meiring worked hard from that point on in 1992 until the explosion in 2002. He managed at some point to secure a permit from the administration of then President Fidel V. Ramos. The permit specifically allowed Meiring to recover some sunken treasure around Mindanao previously owned by the Japanese and Americans. Meiring believed that there existed gold bars and victory notes in the waters around Mindanao. But such an undertaking needed money. A lot of money. From the Manila Times article, it would seem that the monies Silvia Durante mentioned came from the South African government did not really suffice, or maybe had stopped coming in after the first box was found. This eventually, or inevitably, led to a partnership with someone that could potentially finance the treasure hunt. Meiring apparently partnered with a powerful group of treasure hunters in Manila. Now, this is where the story becomes a little bit of a James Bond movie, or at least I think so. This group was said to be connected to another longtime financier of Meiring's called James Rowe, who was at that time a resident of Nevada. Rowe had joined Meiring once during a visit to the Philippines in 1993, but who is he? And why did Hawthorne think that this connection to Rowe may be the reason why Meiring was hurt in that explosion on the 16th of May 2002 at the Evergreen Hotel? Now, James Rowe, according to the Manila Times report, was an executive producer for a company called Wild Rose Productions. Now, the reason I say was is that I did not find any indication that Mr. Rowe or the company Wild Rose Productions still existed. I have looked up the company, I have looked up James Rowe, but even my specific Googling skills did not yield any favorable results. I am, of course, also open to the notion that both Mr. Rowe and the company did not exist at all, but I digress at this moment before you and I both fall into a very, very deep rabbit hole of yet another conspiracy theory. Now, Wild Rose Productions apparently operated out of New Green Valley in Las Vegas, Nevada. One of the projects it was working on during Rowe's friendship with Meiring was a documentary about the infamously mysterious Yamashita treasure allegedly hidden in the highlands of Mindanao. From their report, both Zumalsikat and Andrade seemed to have been able to talk to an American intelligence analyst called Dan Crawford, who was able to shed some more light on who Rowe was. The report did not really give any details as to who Dan Crawford was, how the journalists had become acquainted with him, what his credentials were, or who he exactly worked for at all. But for the sake of this story, let us assume that he and his story can be trusted. Dan Crawford maintained that James Rowe apparently had connections to right-winged white supremacist and tax revolt group within Nevada. Interestingly enough, he was also linked to a neo-Nazi party within the US and the so-called Fifth Reich in Germany. Now, as someone who is partly German, my ears naturally perked up immediately, and I realized that I had never ever heard of a movement called the Fifth Reich in German. Obviously, this term was playing off Hitler's Third Reich in the 30s and 40s Germany that saw the country falling into fascism, National Socialism, and which also led to the death of around 6 million Jewish people, amongst other things. I had heard of the term Fourth Reich, but never a fifth one. My research did not lead anywhere save for a book by somebody called Franz von Falkenstein, or an article from 2011 and some other questionable internet forums that I did not really want to open. It is entirely possible that this was and is some underground group of white supremacists who operated in the dark, or who still operate in the dark and in the dark side of the internet. But on this side of the internet, what I have used, there is no compelling evidence that such a group existed or exists. Now, you might ask, why on earth are we talking about neo-Nazi parties and how does it connect with Meiring? Well, Meiring believed, like other treasure hunters of Yamashita's treasures, that these particular treasures were money, jewel, and gold originally belonging to German Nazis. The descendants of said Nazis had been inspired to search for these treasures, believing fervently that in doing so, they can revive the National Socialist movement Hitler started, and they can have a world run by what they deem to be the superior Aryan race. Now, it is entirely possible that even though Meiring did not really share the neo-Nazi belief or mentality, he really just wanted to have somebody who can finance his treasure hunt of the Yamashita treasures. The fact that Mr. Rowe was producing a movie about these treasures came conveniently for Meiring, or it is possible that Meiring encouraged such a movie production indeed. However, it does concern me that Meiring had other right wing connections. In the Manila Times report, it was mentioned that Meiring had a connection with an American called Chuck Ager, who lived in Colorado at the time and worked as a mining engineer. Ager apparently was given the task to supervise more than 30 tunneling operations in search for the remaining 12 boxes said to be filled not only with the federal notes but also with Yamashita's treasure. Funny enough, I did find a Chuck Ager in my Googling efforts around the internet. I found a Chuck Ager who still works as a geophysical engineer and is the chairman and founder of a mining-related company called Nano Minerals Corporation. The website I happened upon lists all of his professional achievements, and at no point was there any mention of these 30 tunneling operations in the Philippines. Now, in my research, I found that Ager was not free from controversy. He was involved in a nasty court case where he sued a newsletter company for defamation. These were over articles that essentially described him as a fraud. Some years ago, he ran a company called Del Gracia Mining Corporation. He announced that underneath the property there was indeed gold. Stocks in the company gained value quickly, but mining efforts on the said land also quickly concluded that there was no gold whatsoever. Stocks then plummeted and the company crashed. The newsletter reported about this, but the court in this matter agreed that the reporting was indeed defamatory. Now, I am only informing you about this because I think the Chuck Ager that I have found in my research is the same as the Chuck Ager that is mentioned in the Manila Times report. But the bigger question is, why did the Manila Times make an effort to tell us about Meiring's right-wing connections? All the Manila Times article wanted us, the readers, to understand is that these right-wing connections may not have been happy with Meiring's connection to the South African Mandela government and had maybe looked at Meiring's support of Mandela as a betrayal of his own white race. This could have been a motive for wanting Meiring dead or severely injured, but it still does not explain the sudden and cloak and dagger operation by the agents who whisked away Meiring from Davao to Manila 3 days after the explosion. Now, you might ask, why would Meiring's right-wing connections be mad at him for having any connection with the South African government? Hasn't Meiring only dealt with them in 1992 when he sold that one box for $500 million and given that money to Nelson Mandela's government? Well, it is my speculation that from 1992 to 2002, the connection between Meiring and the South African government did not really cease to exist. I think that Meiring continued to support the South African government in one way or the other, and the right-wing connection who financed Meiring's treasure hunting all those 10 years felt betrayed by Meiring and his support of Nelson Mandela, who we know is a Black South African. So, whilst we can continue to speculate on this potential motive for wanting to hurt Meiring, it still does not explain why official-looking men who seem to be part of the US government had suddenly just managed to whisk away Meiring away from Davao to Manila and eventually back to the US. Now, in the Manila Times article, both Hawthorne and Durante, remember, Meiring's private secretary, confirmed that Meiring was fearful of his life weeks before the explosion. When they would ask him why, Meiring remained vague and said that it was something to do with the treasure. It is easy to deduce from this that Meiring was merely fearful that maybe someone would steal the treasure, or that maybe his right wing connections had indeed found out about his support of Nelson Mandela, or maybe Meiring was not really who he said he was. Maybe he was not a mere treasure hunter or doctor at all. Maybe he was entirely something else. The Manila Times article also spoke of how Meiring was in communication with a man from England named Derek S. Fawell within 3 weeks of the Evergreen Hotel blast. Evidence recovered by the intelligence source interviewed by the Manila Times journalists showed that there was a fax saying the following, and I quote, "With regard to your ordnance disposal problem, I have talked with our experts. They will be at your location upon the time frame that you instruct. The device that you have described is highly volatile and must be dealt with quite delicately." End of quote. This quote indicates to me that Meiring knew from the very beginning that something was going to happen, that an explosion was going to take place. Maybe him being injured was not part of the plan, but this quote, talking of ordnance disposal problem, a term usually used in bomb disposal, certainly points to a knowledge of an explosive in the box. Whether these were explosives planted by Meiring himself for delayed detonation later, or whether this was done by someone else to Meiring. The intelligence source who the Manila Times journalists talked to also revealed that Meiring apparently ran his own company that was called Perusia International Trading Incorporated. Weirdly enough, the company used Evergreen Hotel's address in Davao City and telephone number, but another address was also specified in the company's letterhead. It is an English address in North Devon in the UK. The address given by the intelligence source to the Manila Times journalists was Patchole Manor in Kentisbury Ford in North Devon, which is located in the southeast of England. Of course, because I live in England at the moment, I had to look up where this manor was. It exists. It looks like your typical countryside manor and is even on the market for sale. Now, this company, apparently owned by Meiring, is unfortunately not listed in England as a registered company, something that a person like me can look up on the UK government website, because this information is indeed public domain in the UK. I am almost convinced that Meiring merely had some fancy stationery printed to use during business transactions to appear legitimate amongst his business partners or acquaintances. I doubt this company ever really existed. The intelligence source interviewed by the Manila Times journalists said that even though this company was apparently registered in the UK, Meiring's residential address remained in the US. Indeed, his passport showed an address in Calimesa, California, a city located in the greater Los Angeles area. Now, of course, this all doesn't make sense. My natural question would be, were these addresses merely cover-ups for Meiring's true identity and his true occupation and activities? All very legitimate questions, but let us put a pin on those questions, because someone indeed had the same questions as I had and dared to maybe answer them in a book. Now, to add to the theory that maybe Meiring had complete knowledge of the explosion, or maybe he intended the explosion himself, let us circle back to David Hawthorne, Meiring's friend. He revealed to the Manila Times journalists that the security around Meiring at the hospital in Makati tightened, and that he was informed by a Filipino in Davao who was carrying a message from the US Embassy that Meiring would never be charged, that the investigation will not get anywhere because Meiring was a protected person. Meiring would merely be taken back to the United States, and the advice of this messenger? Just forget about the incident, if indeed you are willing to forget it. And sure enough, when I was asking friends and family back in Davao if they remembered this story or if they had any recollection at all about an explosion in 2002 at the Evergreen Hotel, they could not remember anything. I had already left Davao at this point, and smartphones were not a thing yet, so instant access to news was still very much only possible through the news cycle on television or if you went to an internet cafe. But I had not heard of this, and not much of a fuss, I think, was made about this explosion, even though Evergreen Hotel is still located and was back then on a very popular and commercial street in Davao. Furthermore, the fact that the Manila Times article I keep on referencing in this episode had been reprinted, quoted by so many other news outlets in recent years or at the time in 2002 shows to me that the coverage of this explosion and this mystery was minimal even at the time, which is odd in and of itself. Nevertheless, the authors of the Manila Times article kept coming back to this one question, which I think really is the kink of this whole story, the focal point of this mystery. Why would a mere treasure hunter and collector of medicinal herbs merit such attention from the US National Security and the FBI in the first place? In the last installment of their three-parter article, both Zumel Sikat and Andrade outlined how in many instances in history, treasure hunter circles had become infiltrated by intelligence and terrorist operatives, in a way implying that maybe Meiring was perhaps moonlighting as such an operative, or was an operative from the very start, and being a treasure hunter was just a front. Now, I know that Zumel Sikat and Andrade did not really explicitly come out and say that maybe Meiring was indeed an intelligence operative, mainly because they did not want to affect maybe their journalistic integrity by saying something that they could not substantiate. However, somebody did come out and say something to that effect. In his book, Jackals, The Stench of American Fascism, author Alex Constantine made a connection between Meiring and the Abu Sayyaf, which he described as an offshoot of Al-Qaeda to justify interventions in the Philippines. I know, this ride has just gotten a tad wilder, but a word of caution. I have tried to find out who Alex Constantine is, to find out anything that might give me an indication whether he is a respectable historian or educator of sorts, or maybe just a lunatic propagandist. I did not get that far, but one thing did come up that struck me as odd. He reviewed his own book. Yes, you heard right. He reviewed his own book, Jackals, on his own website, which he named the Constantine Report. This was very weird to me, so please take the following with a grain of salt. Now, I will read you a quote from the book. Now, before I do so, please remember that in this quote, he said that the explosion in the Evergreen Hotel happened in 2004, which is incorrect. It actually happened, as we already know, in 2002. And now for that quote. An accidental blast at the Evergreen Hotel in Davao in May 2004 was a clear statement that the Al-Qaeda offshoot, the Abu Sayyaf, still functions as an intelligence front, a proxy army of the U.S. National Security Council that exists to justify intervention in the Philippines. The explosion, publicized in the United States as the work of Abu Sayyaf, was set off by a store of dynamite traced to one Michael Meiring, an African-born, naturalized, proverbial ugly America citizen. Meiring claimed that Abu Sayyaf's mad dogs had lobbed a grenade into his hotel room, an alibi proven to be a fabrication upon examination of the scene by local police. Meiring was so badly injured by the blast that both of his legs were amputated at the knees. The dynamite, Manila Times reported, also tore off his mantle of obscurity, exposing Meiring and his numerous American and Filipino partners to the public limelight. End of quote. Now, the use of the term ugly America worries me, as it read to me like a deeply anti-American propaganda type of literature, akin to how North Korean dictators might describe North America to its North Korean populace. Alex Constantine, in his book, had, as you have heard, essentially concluded that Meiring deliberately set off the explosion to make it look like the Abu Sayyaf had attacked the Evergreen Hotel. Now, if I were reading between his lines, I would say that maybe the dynamite exploded by mistake when Meiring was still in the room, when the original plan may have actually been to be away from Suite 306 at the time of the detonation. This is certainly something that I would be thinking about for a long time. Because even though I am a bit doubtful as to Alex Constantine's legitimacy as an author, historian, or educator on this particular subject, he made quite the connection that the Manila Times article's journalists could not or would not do. In any way, Constantine also wrote about things that we already know from this episode. He knew about Meiring's boxes being filled with U.S. Federal Reserve notes, but in his book, he wrote that the boxes were obtained from the Abu Sayyaf rather than treasure hunted by Meiring himself, which again makes a very interesting connection between Meiring as a possible intelligence operative and the Abu Sayyaf. Constantine also confirmed in his book that the agents who were seen whisking away Meiring from Davao and then from Manila were both agents from the FBI and the U.S. National Security Council. He also wrote that apropos those boxes with treasures, similar boxes were recovered by the U.S. Secret Service and the Philippine Central Bank later on. Other counterfeit bonds and currencies were also recovered in another hotel in Davao at some other time. What struck me as odd is that these counterfeits were shipped to no other place than Las Vegas, Nevada, a place which we already know has a connection with Meiring, or had a connection with Meiring, through his partnership with James Rowe of Wild Rose Productions. Now, this may raise some questions as to whether James Rowe may have been an operative for the US government as well, or for any other intelligence agency. But again, we don't have any information in relation to that, so that will also remain a mystery. Alex Constantine further wrote that Meiring may have had further connections with a CIA operative named Nina North. That is most likely not her real name. She apparently took over backdoor financial transactions in black market gold formerly conducted by another man named Oliver North. Meiring allegedly also had connections to a Filipino-American tax protester from California named Bob Gold, and another man called Fred Obado, who was apparently the leader of the Kodar Kiram terrorist cell and the son of Sultan Jumalul Kiram, the self-proclaimed Sultan of Sulu. Now, I did not find any reference on the internet to a terrorist movement or group named Kodar Kiram, except for sites connected already to Meiring and in relation to Constantine's book. Secondly, Jumalul Kiram, if the internet is to be believed, does not even have a son at all, let alone one called Fred Obado. Obado is also a name that is typical of Kenya, so how someone from Sulu could be named a fairly common Kenyan name is either super coincidental or mere fantastical imagination. Now, Constantine also commented and wrote about Meiring's company Perusia, which we already heard about before. He called the company a shell company, and I am inclined to agree. Constantine wrote that Perusia is actually a word used by right-wing Christian evangelicals and pertains to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Again, seemingly implying here Meiring's right-wing connections. Lastly, Constantine wrote that Meiring was indeed a homegrown American terrorist, mistakenly writing Myers in his book instead of Meiring. He wrote that Meiring, as a homegrown terrorist, was not the only one running loose in the Philippines, hinting at a greater conspiracy plot but not really caring to explain further. Constantine essentially picked up the story that the Manila Times journalists had started. Constantine's seemingly deep distrust of America led him to the conclusion that Meiring was not just a treasure hunter or was not one in the first place at all. Meiring, in his eyes, was an intelligence operative and a terrorist sent to the Philippines to wreak havoc, then blame it on the Abu Sayyaf, who was part of the greater Al-Qaeda network. Now, you must consider the time in which the Evergreen Hotel explosion happened. The Evergreen Hotel explosion happened merely 8 months after the terrorist attack on the Twin Tower in New York on September 11th. And this was also after the US declared its war on terrorism. Constantine may believe that the US was using the Abu Sayyaf as a sort of scapegoat on which to blame attacks in the Philippines to justify intervention and a greater US military presence in the Philippines. And Constantine would not be alone in this belief. A lot of Filipinos believe that the US had made and still concoct reasons to justify its continuous presence in the country. Orchestrating a blast in Davao and blaming it on the Abu Sayyaf could be one of such concoctions. Now, this all happened 18 years ago. Why have some true crime and crime mystery fans dug up this jewel of a story in recent times? Well, the answer is easy. The 2016 presidential elections happened. In 2016, the Filipinos voted in Rodrigo Duterte as the country's new president. Duterte was also the sitting mayor of Davao when the Evergreen Hotel explosion happened in 2002. As I said, Duterte was not happy in 2002. He was not happy that the US agencies intervened and whisked away Meiring to Makati and then back to the US without any explanation, without any chance to maybe hold Meiring accountable for the explosion at the hotel. The police were not able to conduct any investigation and no one could be held accountable for the explosion. Duterte saw this as an affront, an insult to the Philippine sovereignty as a country, and held that grudge all the way to Malacanang when he became the new president. Duterte had always projected this reluctant, distrusting, if not hostile attitude towards the US, and the Meiring case was and is a big contributor to the president's hostile attitude towards the US. Political pundits observed as much and concluded that Washington needed to win over the new president, and part of that would be being candid about the Meiring mystery, especially as there were accusations that indeed Meiring was, in reality, a CIA operative. As a response to the president's disdain for the U.S., the U.S. Embassy in Manila at the time declined to comment about the Meiring affair, as they called it. Instead, they signposted inquiring journalists to the embassy's statement made back in 2002, only admitting that indeed FBI agents went to the Evergreen Hotel to investigate the explosion, but they categorically denied that the agency had any role in Meiring's departure from Davao. So, I guess one of the last questions left is, where is Meiring now? All we know is that when he returned to the US, he used the last name Van der Meer. He died in 2012 at the age of 76 and never told his story until his dying day. His wife, when contacted by the New York Times, declined to comment on anything connected to her late husband's time in the Philippines. And so the Meiring mystery died with Meiring. And we will forever be left to speculate as to what really happened and why, and who Meiring really was. Thank you for listening to this rather roller coaster ride of an episode. Make sure again to tune back in 2 weeks for another story. If you are a patron on Patreon, you will be able to listen to the next story 5 days ahead of the normal publication time. As always, make sure to follow Lagim on all its socials, like on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, on TikTok at Lagim Podcast, and on Facebook, just search for Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. Make sure to also check out Lagim on YouTube. A link to Lagim Podcast's YouTube channel can be found on Lagim's Instagram page. Just check the link in the page's bio. Again, thank you very much for listening. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.